So other than that, let's get going here. Today's webinar is on improving your landscapes or correcting common landscape mistakes. So let me just turn this presentation on, and I'm going to go through just a couple of quick slides, and then we'll actually dig into working on some images here. So a few tips when it comes to preparing for your landscapes, and planning goes a long way in preventing the common mistakes from happening. So things that I always do when I go out to shoot is I always try to scout my locations in advance. That's a great thing to do during the middle of the day when the light isn't typically good for shooting landscapes. Usually you'll go out and you'll shoot in the morning, you can have some lunch, and then in the early afternoon, that's where you start to scout around for what you're going to shoot in the evening. So I'll do some location scouting. Also, different times of year. I may go to one location that I'll photograph and I know, gosh, this would look much better in the fall. So I'll remember that place and I'll go back and I'll visit it in the fall. So different times of day, different seasons make a big difference. Knowing your light in advance is very important too, especially for working in the late afternoon and for sunsets. There's a couple great apps for your smartphones to help with this. There's one called Sunseeker that I use. Light Track is another popular one, and it will actually tell you, it actually brings up a camera view on your app, and it will show you where the sun is going to set and when it's going to set, so you know exactly where to plan your shot. Another great trick, if you don't have a good cell phone reception where you're at, is just use your fingers. That's what the image on the right illustrates. If you stretch your arm out to full arm's length, every finger on your hand is 15 minutes of time. So if you measure from the bottom of the sun to the horizon, you can tell exactly how long it's going to be until sunset. It's really, really accurate. It's an old Boy Scout trick I learned many, many years ago. Other good tips are bring a tripod. Yes, they can be a pain to haul around from time to time, but they really will improve your landscape images, especially giving you the ability to work at longer shutter speeds, which is great for water. And then I always use a polarizer. Anytime I'm outside, it doesn't really matter what I'm shooting. If I'm outdoors, I'm going to use a polarizer. And last but not least, be patient. Light changes very fast, much faster than we think. So what happens with lighting, what happens with clouds can make a big impact on your image. And even shooting multiple images of the same scene over a 10 to a minute to a half hour period, you can get different images and you can use different parts of each of those images to create the image you want. I'll actually show you how to do that here in just a minute. Liz, do you have any other planning tips before I move on to the next slide?
No, I think you covered most of
Liz
them.
for her help. Yeah, Liz is a great photographer in her own right too. All right, so a couple other things to keep in mind when you actually shoot. Tend to compose your image with a little bit of padding. The cameras that most of us shoot with 35mm format digital SLRs shoot in a different aspect ratio than what a lot of the common print sizes are. So you'll have to crop your image when you want to go make a print from it. So if I wanted to make an 8x10 print from my Canon 6D that I shoot with, I'm going to have to crop a little bit off the left and the right. And if I compose my image in the camera so tightly that I can't allow for the cropping, that the cropping is going to damage my composition, what am I going to do? So I tend to like to leave things a little bit loose. These cameras capture such a large image these days that it gives you a little bit of room to crop and recompose after the shot. I always try to pay attention to my level, getting the camera level. This is something I've always had a hard time with through the camera. It looks level to me, but when I get it back in the computer, it's not. And of course, there's ways you can correct that in the computer, but the more you can do in the camera, the better. So a lot of the newer cameras actually have a built-in level that you can turn on the back of the camera, or some you can even see through your viewfinder, where as you level your camera on the tripod, you can actually see what the level actually is. Or they make these little bubble levels you can snap into your hot shoe, which help out. Pay attention to the corners in your image. Really pay attention to everything in your image, but the corners are easy to forget and to have distractions in. I always like to bracket my image, or at the bare minimum try to expose for the highlights, for maintaining the highlight detail. With digital software, you can bring up a lot of information out of the shadows, but it's much harder to bring back realistic information in the highlights. And then do your, what I kind of call your retouching. It's more of your scene propping before the shot. It's what I call 5-second Photoshop. You can do a lot in the real world before you ever actually take the picture that will save you tons of time in the camera. So a lot of times I will move branches or grass out of the way. I might collect leaves and distribute them in the scene where I want them to go. I'm sure there's some purists out there who are going to complain about that, but I think as long as you're respectful of the scene, I'm not going to move a giant log. I'm not going to cut anything that's permanent. I'm going to stay in marked areas. I'm not going to go off the trail. I'm not going to go trampling past a fence or past a guardrail to get my shot. And as long as it's something that would honestly happen, you know, leaves fall in the autumn time. I'm not going to bring a bag full of leaves with me and use them in the spring. That would be unrealistic. But in the fall, if there's leaves there, moving a few leaves around isn't that bad to do. You know, like this shot right here, those leaves weren't there, so I propped those. But you know, literally 2 feet out of the camera frame, there were a bunch of leaves, so I just picked up the 2 leaves and I set them there to change that shot. All right, let's see. I think that is it. Any questions on any of those tips or any other tips that anybody would like to mention before we move on and actually start to do some work with the Perfect Photo Suite on our landscapes?
There was actually a great
Anything out there,
question
Liz?
about when you are bracketing, how many stops do you usually bracket?
That's a good question, and it really kind of depends a lot on the scene. It depends on what the dynamic range of the scene is. So if I'm photographing on a bright sunny day, which you know is a typical time to have to do that. Oops, here, let me jump out of this presentation. We don't need it anymore. I would probably do a 7 or a 9 shot bracket, and with 1 stop between each, so you could get a 7 stop or a 9 stop range. If it's a day where it's lower contrast, a cloudy day, or it's the sun, our bright light source isn't going to be in the shot, it could be a much smaller bracket. It might be only 4 stops, or I may only do it manually. It may not be something I'm planning on doing for HDR, even though I'll shoot a larger bracket so that I have the option to use HDR later. In many cases, I don't actually use HDR. I actually just blend 2 different exposures together manually. And I'll show you guys how to do that today as well.
Okay.
All right, cool. Let's dig in. I'm going to use Lightroom to keep track of my images today. This is actually my personal catalog that we're working out of. A common question that people ask is how do you actually organize your images? So I'll spend just 1 minute on that. I have one big hard drive where I keep all of my images. It's my personal images drive or my personal images folder on this volume. And inside of it, I work based on categories. Now, people have different methods for organizing. They might organize by year and then by month. To me, that's never been that useful because I can never remember when I shot something, and there's metadata that I can search to find the date range of something. I remember what I shot, so I like to organize by what it was. If you're a professional commercial photographer, a lot of times you're organizing by client instead because that's the way you think about it. It's not what you shot, it's who you shot for. So I organize based on subject matter. So I kind of have top-level folders for each subject matter. So if I was to open up my landscapes folder, I then break it down by locale. So I'll break it down by, in this case, by state or country, and then I'll roll down, let's do Oregon, because that's where we live, and I'll have a lot of images in there. And then when we roll down Oregon, I'll have subfolders for each place that I've shot. And again, I don't really worry about time. If it's a place that I photograph often, like in the Columbia Gorge, which is very near to Portland, and I shoot there quite a bit, I may shoot the same scene many times. I'm okay if they all go in the same folder because I can sort them by date in there. And then inside of one of these folders, let's see if there's an interesting one to look at, maybe something like Bridal Veil Falls. And then you'll see all of the images just for that scene. And typically, I will stack images of the same shot together. That's actually a really cool feature of Lightroom, is I can take all of the images, basically all of the images that are the same bracket, and I can stack those up, and it lets me collapse those images down into what look like just a couple of images on disk, but in reality could be quite a few. You know, there's actually 77 images in this folder, but it actually only looks like a handful of shots because I have all of the images that are similar stacked underneath it. All right, so let's actually get to work on some images. I've created a collection with a few images that we're going to work on today. And the first one we're going to do is actually the one where we kind of prop those leaves in. I'm going to show you some ways to optimize this image. I'm just going to select the image. I'm going to go up to the File menu in Lightroom, down to Plugin Extras, and I'm going to select the Perfect Photo Suite. Now, if I select Perfect Photo Suite or Layers, it's going to open the image up into layers first, and then from layers, I can send it to any module in any order that I want. And that's kind of the way I like to work. It gives me the most flexibility. If I wanted to send it to an individual module straight away, I could do that. I could send it to Perfect Effects, do my work in Effects, and it would come straight back to Lightroom. I'm going to go ahead and send this to the suite, though. That way I have the ability to pick which modules and which order I want to send them into. So it'll open that image up here into the suite. There we go. You notice I'm in layers. On the right, there's my layers palette. First thing I always do is I make a copy of the image. I make a copy of the layer. So I just hit right here on the copy button, and that creates a new copy. The great thing about that copy is it allows me to always go back to my original image as a reference. And I'll do that quite a bit as I'm working to make sure that I'm still kind of keeping the spirit of the original image. It's very easy to over-enhance or over-retouch something. And if I have that original in there, it lets me always go back by just changing my layer opacity of my work. All right, first thing I'm going to do is get rid of some distractions. This is what I'm talking about looking at the corners of your shot. And there's some distractions in this image that I don't like. Down here in the bottom left, there's a little piece of a rock sticking out that causes a distraction, and actually across the whole top edge there's a little bit of a distraction. So a simple thing I could do would just be to recrop the image and crop some of that detail off. So I'm going to do that. We'll just grab the crop tool here, and I'm just going to grab the top, and I'm going to bring it down just enough that I'm getting rid of some of those distractions at the top, down to about there. There we go. Then we'll use the Perfect Eraser. The Perfect Eraser is new in Suite 8, so if you guys have Suite 8 and you haven't used it yet, I'd highly recommend it. It's probably my biggest go-to retouching tool these days. We'll just select that Perfect Eraser and make it a little bit larger. Now I'm using the bracket keys on my keyboard to change the brush size, the same that you would in Photoshop or a lot of other applications. You can always change it up here in the tool options bar as well. Excuse me. You can use the scrubby that's built in. You notice when I mouse over the label that says size, I get two little arrows that oppose each other. That means I can just click and I can drag to the right to make the brush bigger, or left to make it smaller, or from the little pop-up I get a slider and I can make the brush bigger or smaller. For me, I really like using those bracket keys because it doesn't require me to move my cursor out of the image, and I can see the size of the brush while I'm adjusting. All right, so I'm going to grab that Perfect Eraser tool, and I'm just going to paint over what I want to get rid of, which in this case was that little distraction in the bottom left, and it will usually just fill that little guy in there. I might take a stroke or two to get rid of it completely. There we go. So that removes that little annoying guy there. And I'll just kind of repeat this process around the image, removing a few other of the small distractions. While I'm doing this, which is admittedly a little bit boring, I'll see if Liz has any questions from the audience.
Yeah, there was someone who was asking if you could just tell everybody what the shutter speed for this photo was. They really like all of the, I had quite a few comments about people who really like that flowing water.
Let's take a look. Let's take a look here. So up here in the navigator, you notice there's tabs for the navigator, which if I'm zoomed in, lets me move around the image. There's a loop view, which lets me take a magnified section of the image, a histogram that'll give me an idea of the distribution of the colors in the image and let me know where things are white and black. And the far right one is info, and this will give me the metadata about the image. So this one was actually shot at 4 seconds right here. 4 seconds at f13, so I stopped down quite a bit so that I could get that 4-second exposure. And of course, this was photographed at 100 ISO. This was a cloudy day, and I had a polarizer on top of it, which will knock off about 2 stops of light as well. So this image normally would have been about a 1 second at f13, but by adding that polarizer, it knocked it down to 4 seconds. So you get the benefit of the neutral density along with that polarization as well. The other cool thing is you'll notice my camera actually records the GPS metadata in the image. So if I click on that little GPS button, it'll actually bring up Google Maps and tell me exactly where that image was taken. All right, let's see. We were removing a few dusties here, so I think there's a couple more little ones I want to get rid of. One here, one here. This is one of those things where it's very easy to go nuts and find all the little things that bug you. As a matter of fact, this little dark area at the top up here even kind of bugs me a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of see if I can smooth that out a little bit. That was probably too big of an area. Nope, actually worked pretty well. There we go. Now, remember how I mentioned I always make a copy of the original? Here's where that benefit comes in. I can turn that layer on and off, and I can see the before. There it is with all the little dusties and distractions in there, and then after when I turn it off. Another handy tip when you're doing this type of retouching, and I'll do this frequently, is to rotate your image around 180 degrees. So you're looking at it upside down. And that will kind of makes it more abstract, and it lets you see things that your eye normally kind of forgives. It lets you notice things like bright corners or distractions better. And you can do that really easily in the suite just by grabbing the transform tool up here at the top, and then just click the flip vertical button. And that'll flip the image upside down temporarily and will let you look at things. It helps you analyze the image to kind of plot your course of what you want to do. So for me, I've got kind of what I will call a light trap. I've got this light corner down here and this light corner down here. I'm going to want to burn those down in my final version because they create little pockets of light that distract the eye. And they're easier to notice when you flip it upside down. All right, now I think we're ready to send this off to Perfect Effects to do some work. So I'll just click on Effects. And we're going to keep this actually pretty simple. I'm really just going to use the adjustment brush mostly to go ahead and correct some color and add some detail to the image. So the adjustment brush, it lives right here at the bottom of the stack, and it allows me to paint in results wherever I'd like them to appear. So I'm just going to grab this adjustment brush, I'm going to click on it, and I'm just going to roll up these blending options here so we have a little bit more room. I have my image on the, or my screen set a little bit smaller so we have more room to work on. I'll click the detail preset, and what this has done is it's loaded up my brush with detail. That means wherever I paint on the image, it's going to appear sharper. So now I'm just going to paint that additional detail on this rock in the foreground because I really kind of want it to pop and be more obvious. And I'm painting at a 100% opacity. I want this to get the full amount of my detail adjustment. There we go. And then on the second rock, the one down here, I'm just going to reduce my opacity down to about 50 or 60 and paint on there. That will add a little bit of the detail, but not as much detail as the main subject matter, the other rock. There we go. Let's just turn that on and off so you can see what that does. That just adds just a little bit of pop. It adds a little bit of sharpness, a little bit of local contrast to that rock, which is really my main subject matter in the scene. There we go. Now I'll just add another layer on top of this. And now we'll go to the color enhancer. I'm going to show you one of the tips that I use a lot when I'm working on a landscape, and that is the ability to change a local color in the image. When the color enhancer comes up, automatically it's going to try to detect and remove a color cast. You notice how the auto button is turned on up here. I don't like the color cast removal that it's done in this case, so I'm just going to turn that off, and I'll make any color adjustments that I want to manually instead. What we want to do is change colors within the scene just a little bit. And I do this a lot when I photograph anything that has greens in it. You'll notice that the green in this moss that covers the rock, a lot of it is yellow, and even some of it is orange. What I really want to do is I want to kind of clean up those greens and make them look more green, a more vivid green color. So an easy way to do that is with this color range tool. I'm just going to select the yellows. This will take just the yellows in the image and allows me to adjust them. Now, it's going to affect the leaves. That's okay. We're going to paint it off the leaves here in just a minute. So ignore what the leaves look like and just look at the moss. I'm just going to shift the yellows from the yellows more towards the greens. And you can see how automatically the greens look more green. And I'll bring up the saturation of those just a little bit as well. Again, don't worry about what it looks like on the leaves. We'll use the brush tool, and I'm just going to paint that off of the leaves. We really only want it on the moss. Now, conversely, I could always invert this mask and just paint it in on just the moss as well. It kind of depends on how much is adversely affected by it. So there we go. That keeps our leaves that nice, pretty orange color. That's looking a bit better. Now, let's go ahead and I think we're going to try to remove a little bit of the color from the water in the scene. So I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to go back to my color enhancer. Again, turn that auto color adjustment off. And then I'm just going to bring the saturation down a little bit. And what this will do is it'll help remove some of the color from the water. And again, I'm applying it to the entire image right now, but I'll use the brush to paint it off the areas that I don't want to affect. I don't want to affect the rocks or the leaves. So I'm just going to make sure my opacity is all the way up, and then I'm just going to paint that over the areas where I want to maintain all the color. There we go. That looks a bit better, and then we'll finish this off with a vignette. The vignette is going to help me to darken those two corners at the bottom that are a bit distracting. So we'll just click on the plus button, and I'm just going to use the presets on the left. I'm going to scroll down to the vignette category. We'll open it up, and this will make it easier for us just to go shopping and find one that we want to add to it. Let's see. Let's go with subtle. We'll start there. And of course, with any of the filters that you add from the left, these are presets for the filters at the bottom. You can then go in and adjust their settings manually. So I can control the center of the vignette, which I can move around using the centering tool. I'll show you that here in a second. And we can adjust the brightness. I'm just going to darken those corners down a little bit more. There we go. And then I really want the darkening to happen on the bottom, not as much on the top corner. So using the centering tool, I'll just move the center of the image up just a little bit. So that'll darken the bottom a little bit more and leave the top less affected by the vignette. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to turn the preview on and off so we can see before and after for that. So there's before, our original image. There's after. Just doing a little bit of work here in effects. I'm going to apply it. And while this is applying, let's see if there's any questions out there, Liz.
Yes. There are a lot of people in here. It's not quite as related to the editing process, but there are a lot of people in here who are asking questions about polarizers and neutral density filters. So
Sure.
kind of what the differences are, when you use which one. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about them.
You bet. There's definitely a difference between them. And what a polarizer does is it aligns the light that comes into the lens. So when light strikes your scene, it bounces off all sorts of the subject matter in your scene and kind of comes in at different angles. And those different angles are the things that cause glare on water. It can reduce the vibrancy of colors. So what a polarizer does is it aligns all that light. It'll cut through haze. So if there's a great distance between you and your subject matter, let's say you're photographing a mountain, it'll reduce the haze on the mountain or between you and the mountain, so that atmospheric distortion will be reduced. On water, you'll be able to control the reflection on it, so you could either maintain or remove the reflection on water so you can see through it. And it will just make the colors in your image brighter. A lot of times, even with green leaves or green grass, the sun reflects off of those and you'll get little sparkly highlights. That polarizer can help reduce that down so that the greens become more consistent. So I use a polarizer all the time whenever I shoot outside. It does have the benefit that it also acts as a neutral density filter as well. It will reduce the light usually by about 2 f-stops. It depends on the brand and the type of polarizer, but usually around 2 f-stops. So that can make a big difference on a bright sunny day of being able to get water that's smooth or water that isn't at all. Then on top of that, you can get just regular neutral density filters, and a neutral density filter is kind of like sunglasses for your camera. It just reduces the amount of light that comes through. It doesn't do the polarization like a polarizer does. It just cuts down the amount of light, and it allows you to shoot at longer and longer shutter speeds. So if you're working on moving water and you want to get a really, really flowy water oftentimes, and it's a very popular look these days, photographing things like lakes and rivers and even the ocean, to get that very, very smooth look, you need a very long exposure to do that, and using a lot of neutral density can help with that as well. A tip is always put your polarizer on the outside if you're using stacking neutral density and polarizers. If you put the polarizer on the inside, it can create some moire patterns with heavy neutral density. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, that was great.
Any others, Liz?
It actually looks like you answered most of them about the neutral density and the polarizers. I was waiting to jump in there and have to ask something else, but you just went with it. So
good, I
that was
just
great.
barreled right through it. So, all right. So let's take a look at the before and the after on this image. So again, the cool thing about working through layers and maintaining that layered workflow is it kind of lets you see your work as you progress through it. So I'm just going to turn my results from Perfect Effects off, and you can see there's my original image where I started. Above that, there's the retouching, so you can see where we remove some little distractions. And then above it are results from Perfect Effects, where we remove some of the color from the water. I like my water to be white. Some people like it to be blue. It always looks like it's, you know, a tiny bowl crystal has fallen in the water or something. I think water should be white. And we brought up some detail. We made the greens a really strong green instead of that weak yellow green on this image. All right. Looks like I've been babbling a long time on this one. Let's go work on another one. I'm just going to close this one and not save it, and we'll go back to Lightroom and pick another one to work on. The next thing I want to work on is actually show you guys how to blend two exposures together. Now, in a lot of cases, this would be the type of task you do in HDR, but I believe you can actually do quite a bit without HDR. What I've got here is an image shot at Red Rock in Las Vegas. There's this cool pool of water at the bottom, and it's very hard to see in this dark exposure where I'm exposing for the rock that's above the water. It's very dark, but if we, oops, sorry, I'm lost. There we go. Here's a version where we exposed for the water at the bottom instead. Now, normally that water is very, very dark. It's almost a blackish, brackish color. This lets us see through the water. What I want to do is combine these two together so that I can get the light-colored water at the bottom and the dark-colored rock at the top. So I'll just select both of these images at the same time. You can do this in Lightroom or with Aperture or with the Browse module that's built into the suite. You can select multiples, then go to File, plug in Extras, and I'm going to select Open as Layers in Perfect Layers. And that's a little bit different. Normally, if I've selected multiple files and I send it to Layers or a module of the suite, they're going to open up as individual files. With this option, it's actually going to take those two and it's going to merge them in together into one layered file. And because I photographed on a tripod, and again, that's another great reason for working with a tripod, is it's going to I don't have to worry about aligning those two images up. They're automatically aligned because they were registered together on the tripod. I'm going to get rid of the drawer on the left so we have a little bit more room to work. You can just grab the little divider and just drag it to the left, or you can use the Control left or Command left arrow key to remove those. There we go. Now, lots of different ways to do this. It's all going to involve some masking to do it. The way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to grab the bottom layer that happens to be the one that is brighter. I'm going to drag it up on top, and I am just going to start off with the masking bug, which will live right here underneath the masking brush tool. The masking bug is a flexible gradient mask tool. It makes it easy to blend things together in a more natural way without having to use the brush. The brush requires a lot of work. I have to paint this, in this case, 2/3 of the image in with the brush, and I have to be very careful on the edge to create a natural transition. The bug makes it a lot faster. So I'm just going to grab the masking bug. I'll use one of the built-in presets. I'm just going to use the linear bottom, oops, sorry, let's use linear top option. There we go. And you can see how it's now masking the upper layer away, so it's hiding the upper layer, showing me the bottom layer through it. To move it, I'll just click in the center of the tool, That lets me control its up and down, and there's a little handle that hangs off of it that I can use to rotate it. There we go. I'll just drag it down here to about there. The little dash lines control the feather, how quickly it transitions from one layer to the next. So I can control that. I'm going to use a nice soft transition, about like so. There we go, and voila, I've done the majority of the blending of those two layers together just using a simple gradient mask created by the masking bug. Of course, I can always override that with the brush and I can touch it up a little bit more. So we'll grab the brush tool and I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger. Again, using those bracket keys to do that. You can also use, move the brush down here so it's a little easier to see its outline. You can also use the bracket keys to control other options about the brush. So just using the normal bracket keys will make it bigger or smaller. But if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your keyboard and you, maybe it's Control. Oh, sorry, it's Shift. I forgot. If you use the Shift key and then you use those brackets, it's going to change the feather of the brush, so basically how soft the brush is. The distance between the inner circle, that's the hard 100% edge, and the outer circle, the soft edge. So if those two circles are really far apart, it's going to create a really soft edge. If those two circles are really close together, it's going to paint with a harder edge. So I'm going to create a nice soft brush like that, and then I'm just going to paint along the edge here just a little bit more to clean that up. Let's clean up the mask a little bit. And one of the reasons I want to do this is I want to create a dark edge along the rock between the rock and the water that's underneath it. And normally there will be that little dark edge there because it's where as the water fluctuates, as it moves up and down with vibration, or as it evaporates throughout the day, it creates a little darker ring along the edge. And I like that little dark ring along there, so I want to make sure that I'm maintaining that ring. So I'm just going to paint right along here. There you go. You can see a little easier right there where that dark ring starts to appear. There we go. So now let's just blend those two together. No HDR required. Actually, a lot more control than what I would have with HDR. And at the same time, maybe I want to lighten this area back here. This little pool of water actually creates a cavern that goes way back here. I want to lighten that up a little bit more. To do that, I can just change my paint mode. So rather than painting away the upper layer, I'm just going to change it to painting in the upper layer. And I'm going to use a really small amount. I only want to use like 10 at the most. And this is going to allow me to selectively lighten areas now. So now I can brush back here in this little cave, and I can bring up some of the lightness in the background and in the water. There we go, like that. So it allows me to selectively blend those two layers together, getting the lights and darks from the areas that I want. And the cool part is, because each of those layers is still independent, I can adjust large areas all at once. So for example, I don't like this little rock that's here in the water. That happens to be in the foreground layer, so we'll use our perfect eraser, and I'm just going to get rid of this little distracting rock right there. Same thing, there might be another little one here that I want to get rid of, and here. And then the next step is I want to go in and I now want to adjust the rocks above, but I don't want to affect the water below. So just by changing my layer, selecting the layer that contains that rock information, I can now go and adjust it. I want to really bring up the detail, and I want to bring in a little bit more warmth to it, more like what the color down in the water looks like. So we'll go to Perfect Enhance to do that. There we go. Again, I'm just going to close that preset drawer on the left so we have a little bit more room to work. I'm going to start by increasing my detail slider. That will start to bring up some of that detail in the rocks. There we go. I'm going to shift my temperature to make it a little bit warmer. So I just drag it towards the orange. And the cool thing is, you notice, I'm going to crank this really up high, not higher than I would normally would do it, but just so you can see how it's only affecting that layer. The rocks that are under the water don't change at all. So even if I went the other direction, you can see how I'm only affecting part of the image. That's the cool thing about that layered workflow. I think while I'm at it, maybe we could darken those rocks a little bit too. That'll make those color in the rocks a little bit stronger, and maybe increase the blacks. If you hold down the J key on your keyboard, it'll actually let you see the blacks in the image. Now, so far, there's very little black. There's this tiny little bit of black right there where you see blue. I'm going to turn this way up, and you can see as I turn this up, wherever you see that vivid blue color, those are the pure blacks. So I want to adjust that until I have just a little bit of real black in my image. And that's a visual adjustment. So holding down that J key makes it easy. It worked for the highlights as well. So if I hold down that J key and I adjust the whites, this image I may not be able, yeah, I can get a little bit. You can see up there in the rocks, anything that turns red is pure white. I really want to have not really any pure whites because this image doesn't really have any. So I'm going to keep that pretty low. There we go. That looks pretty cool. Maybe a little darker than I wanted. Let me bring that brightness back up just a little bit. There we go. I'm going to apply that, and we'll take it back into Perfect Layers. All right, any questions on how we blended those two layers together to merge and create one exposure?
There was just a question. If you could point out where the masking brush is. I think there were a couple people who were just a little confused about it. Maybe you could just quickly go over that.
Sure. Sure. So the masking brush is right here underneath the trim tool. That's the one that looks like scissors. There's the masking brush, and below that are the masking bug. And the masking brush and the masking bug both are designed to do the same thing. It's to create what we call a mask. And what a mask does is it temporarily hides information on one layer. And we're going to go up to the layer where we actually have the mask. In your layer stack, next to the icon for the image, you see an icon for the mask. And that's this black and white image. And we can actually show you what that looks like. I'm going to do a split screen here. The after image, the results on the right. The one on the left is actually showing us what that mask looks like. And there's a couple different ways to preview a mask. This is using a red overlay. So anything that is red on the left is going to hide information on that layer. I'm going to switch it from the red to the grayscale, which is kind of the classic way of viewing that mask. So wherever a mask is white, it's showing that current layer. Nothing's being hidden. Wherever it is black, or as it moves away from white, you're hiding more and more of that layer, showing whatever is underneath it. So in this case, all this area that's black, this big black area, is hiding the overexposed rock and revealing the darker rock that's underneath it. And that area that's white is maintaining the water at the bottom, and this little finger of gray that we painted up there, that's actually what we use to lighten back in the cavern just a little bit. So as I paint, I'm going to use my brush here to show you how this works. So hopefully this will make a bit more sense. When you do a split screen like this in the suite, the left side is there for reference, but all your work is actually done on the right hand side. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger here, and I'm just going to paint with my paint mode of paint in. That's going to paint with white. And you see as I paint, what that's doing is it's revealing the light layer that's on top, the layer that we're working on. So we're unmasking it. We're revealing that layer itself. I'm just going to undo using Control Z or Command Z to undo that. So did that help out, hopefully?
Yeah, that was perfect.
If you want to learn more about kind of the fundamentals of masking, I think Liz has some other video tutorials on that that'll help you out too. Let's go back to our after view.
There was one other question here that I got quite a bit. Can you combine the layers to edit them as a whole instead of just separately?
Yes, yes, and there's definitely times when you want to do that. And there's kind of two different ways. One thing you could do is you could just merge everything down, which is kind of the heavy-handed approach, because once you merge those down, you can't go back to them. Instead, what I like to use is up here in the layer menu. There's an option called New Stamped Layer, and that will create a new layer above the layer that you're working on, and it stamps all that stuff together. So basically, you get what it would look like if you merged everything together, but you still have all the other layers underneath it, so that if for some reason I wanted to go back and make a change, I can do that. So I'll use that New Stamped Layer command. There we go. So now on the top of my layer stack, I have one new layer that contains everything underneath it squished together. And I'll use that quite a bit when I'm working in this type of a workflow where you're combining multiple images together, because then when I want to send it to a module and I want to apply the same look across the entire image, that's when you'll create that stamped copy like that. All right, let's go ahead and work on our next image here. I'm going to close this one. Let's go back to Lightroom and pick out another one. So what are we at, 940. All right, we're going to talk about how to replace this guy and how to bring back some sunshine to your image. So I'm going to start with this rather dark image. This shot late afternoon with the sun actually no longer falling on the scene. And I really want the sun to look like it's falling onto the image. So let's go ahead. I'm going to grab the image. We'll send it to the suite. There we go. And I'm going to send it to Perfect Effects. And we're going to use that to lighten and brighten the image, bring up these little purple flowers, and make it look like the sun was still in there. So let's go to Effects. There we go. And I'm going to go down, I'm going to use a new tool called the Sunshine Filter right here. You notice whenever you mouse over any of the filters on the left, there's a little quick view browser icon. Just click on that and it'll give you a larger full screen version of what that will look like on your image. So you can then go in and pick one you'd like to use. Now, this image actually probably could use a little bit more adjustment before we get to sunshine. So I'm just going to back this out and let's go to our tone enhancer because we really want to brighten the image a bit first. Let's go to Tone Enhancer, and let's just grab the Lighten preset. This will help us get started. That'll lighten the image up a little bit, and then we can then adjust what it looks like down here at the bottom using the brightness and contrast controls. It's automatically set a white and a black point for me. That means if I hold down that J key on my keyboard again, you'll notice how we get just a tiny little bits of black, that's the blues, and just a tiny little bit of whites. There we go. I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit more. I'm going to use the shadows control to open up those shadows a little bit and maybe adding just a little bit more contrast to the image and some detail. So this will help us just kind of brighten and lighten the image a little bit. There we go. Now we want to bring up these little purple flowers a bit. I'll click on the plus button. We're going to use that same trick that we did on the leaves. We'll go to the color enhancer. We're going to go down to color range, and I'm just going to grab the purples. That's the color of those little flowers. They're purple. And then I can just shift the hue and the saturation to make those guys really pop out a bit more. There we go. So that'll make the little purple flowers a little bit more vivid, make them jump out a little bit more. Now, while I'm here, I think the image could be just a little bit warmer too. So let's just drag that warm slider to the right just to warm things up just a little bit. Maybe we'll enhance those greens too at the same time just by grabbing that yellow and just shifting it to the right just a little bit. There we go. Now we're ready for adding in some sunshine. So we'll click the plus button. We'll go over to our presets on the left, and let's go back to sunshine. And let's grab one that looks good to us. Let's grab maybe what kind of a glowing look, so we'll grab sun glow. There we go. And what that sunshine filter does is it helps add back in the appearance of sunlight actually falling on your scene. I'm just going to grab the sunshine amount slider. I'll bring it all the way down to 0. So you can see that's kind of the original flat look where we're not getting any direct sunlight. And as I bring that amount slider up, you'll see how it starts to look like it's getting more and more actual sunlight falling on the scene. So I can adjust that to the amount that I want. I can also change the warmth, add some saturation, and add glow. And I'm going to just a touch more glow to it. There we go. That's looking pretty cool. Now all we need to do is put in a sky that'll look better with this. I'm going to hit the apply button. That will bake in our adjustments from effects. Then we'll go pick out a sky in perfect layers, and I'll show you how to put in a new sky. While it's cooking there, Liz, do we have any questions?
Yes. I just lost it. There are lots of questions in here, you guys. I'm trying to get to them as fast as I can. But do remember that there are 850 people in here today, so just in case your questions don't get answered, I promise I'm not doing it on purpose. There have been a whole bunch of questions about fill flash from the start all the way up to now. So I was wondering if you could talk about whether you use fill flash in your landscapes and maybe mention it just a bit.
That's a good question, and in the past I have. I don't as much today, and I think there's a couple different reasons for that. One with HDR and with layers, it's easier to blend things together. I think the only time I would probably use fill flash is if I had something I needed to freeze, because that's something Flash does a really good job of, is actually freezing action. So if I had a scene with maybe a bird in it in the foreground or an insect and I really wanted to freeze it, make sure it was sharp in my image, I would do that. But past that, I don't really use a lot of fill flash anymore for landscape stuff. Usually things are far enough away that the flash isn't going to help out that much. All right, let's see. We wanted to replace the sky. So the first step is to go shopping for a new sky. I'm just going to bring that drawer on the left open again, and I'll go to the Extras tab here inside of Layers. With a suite, we include a bunch of extras like backgrounds, borders, and textures. And you can, of course, import your own now with the new Extras Manager. If you've upgraded to Suite 8.1, you can import your own backgrounds, borders, and textures. And actually, Liz has a really cool texture pack. I think it's on the website. Let's go to Backgrounds and to the Skies category. And let's just roll it down and go see if we can find a sky that matches. Now, the trick of replacing skies is you want to find one that is about the same time of day, so it's going to be a little bit more plausible, and about the same angle. So I'm going to use this kind of late afternoon fluffy clouds. I just double click and use the Add as a Layer option. So rather than opening it as a new file in a new tab, it's going to insert it as a new layer in here. Now I'm using one of the built-in ones, but if you have your own sky you want to put in, you could go back to Browse or back to Lightroom, wherever you were working from, wherever you manage your images, and then use that Open as a Layer option, and it'll insert it in just like this as its own layer into the scene. Then we'll use our Transform tool. We're going to move it, size it, and position it on our image where we want it to go. There we go, maybe something like that. I'll just want to make sure that the horizon lines are about the same. The easy way to do that is to use the layer opacity. You can turn that down and you can actually see the two layers together while you're adjusting. So I'm going to adjust those just a little bit. There we go, about like that. So that just lines up our sky and the clouds where we want it to go. Drag it underneath the layer, so it's going to be temporarily hidden. And now we just want to get rid of this ugly white sky and let the nice cloudy sky shine through. There's several different tools in the suite for doing it, and it kind of depends on how complicated your horizon line is. Now in this case, I have a very complicated horizon. I have lots of trees and branches, so I'm going to use Perfect Mask to do this. So I'll just click on the Mask button. I want to make sure that the right layer is selected, which it is. We'll click on Mask. Perfect Mask really contains all the tools that I need for creating a great looking mask to blend those together. And we're actually going to use a different tool than we normally use. Normally I would use the drop brush to get rid of this sky, but because I've got so many tiny little intricate pockets of sky in here, we're going to use the magic brush instead. The magic brush works by comparing colors you want to keep and colors you want to get rid of. And on a bright sky like this, it's pretty easy. I'm going to use the drop icon or the drop tool, and I'm just going to grab a couple of colors out of my sky. You notice as I click to select those colors, they appear over here in my drop color set. So there we go. I'm going to grab a few colors to get rid of. Then I'll do the same thing, but I'm going to pick the colors I want to keep. So I'll use the Keep Eyedropper, and I'm just going to grab a couple different greens and browns from my scene, like that, kind of a light, medium, and dark green. And then we'll grab the magic brush. the magic brush works by just comparing those colors, and it's going to paint away the whitish bluish colors and keep all the greenish brownish colors. And as I do this, you'll actually see the new sky appear as I paint through here, and you notice how it keeps all those tiny little leaves in there. So this is the most precise tool in the suite when it comes to masking. It's a color-based tool, so there has to be a difference between your foreground and your background for it to work, but in this case it works very, very well, and it maintains all those tiny little leaves in the sky, just like that. So there we go. That's how we can replace the sky in a scene. Let's go ahead and I'm going to apply that here. And let's compare that to our original image. So there's our original image out of the camera. And there's our results after a little bit of perfect effects and replacing the sky. Any questions on that one?
Doesn't look like we have any questions so far, but I'm suspecting. Oh, there it is. There's a question. Does there have to be a large difference between the color of the foreground and the background when you're removing a sky?
Not really. I've done, some really tough things like, a wedding veil on basically a bright white sky. I would say you probably need about 8 to 10, RGB pixel value difference in order for it to work. It really comes down to picking the right colors when you do that. And we have lots of videos on working on perfect mask in those areas where things are difficult. The further apart they are, the faster and the easier it's going to be.
One of the other questions that we had is there a way that you can view your mask? I know you showed it a little bit earlier, but maybe you could just show it up again.
Sure. In any of the modules where you do masking, which is most of them, you can always just do Control M will show you your mask that you're working on, just like that. And that'll show it in whichever mode you have selected. So in this case, I had the grayscale mode selected. If I went to the red mode, it would show me what it looks like in the older style red Rubylith mask. And if you do the split screen, you can see your mask and results at the same time. Like, let's come back here. So I can see the results and the mask, and even as I paint, I can see the effects to the mask and the effects to the image. So it's really handy to actually go in and look at the grayscale mask, see where there's flaws are, which might be hard to see in the actual image, and I can then make adjustments in there. All right, I think I have time for one more image, and this is really going to be one of those kind of saving it shots. So sometimes you don't really have a choice in what happens. You don't have the ability to plan in advance. You're on a vacation. You don't have your tripod. It's whatever you can get. So you shoot it and you think, gosh, hopefully I can come up with something cool with it later. And this is a good example of this. In a lot of cases, this would almost be a throwaway shot. There's not a lot I can do. I've got this building that's under renovation on the left. I've got power lines and junk everywhere. But let's show you how we can actually take an image like this that would normally be a throwaway and actually do something kind of fun with it. So I'm just going to grab that image again, plug in extras, send it to the suite, and we'll get to work on it. All right, first thing, make a copy of it so I can always go back to my original. And I'm just going to concede the whole left-hand side. Nothing I'm going to be able to do to get rid of this building, or not without a ton of work. So let's just crop it out. So I'm going to grab the crop tool, and we're just going to adjust it so that we get rid of it, right up to about there. We'll just recompose our shot. We'll make it more square. There we go. Then let's put the perfect eraser to work. Perfect eraser is pretty darn cool. You would be amazed what you can actually get rid of with it. So I'm going to just start painting through here, getting rid of some of these annoying little power lines that are in the shot. It's going to take me a minute to go through and remove all these. So while I'm doing that, I'll see if Liz has any questions or comments from the audience.
There was a question about when you're combining multiple images together, do they need to be the same size? So when you combined that sky in the background with the foreground, you had to upsize it with the transform tool. Is that always going to be the case that you just upsize it, or do you ever need to go into resize?
Uh, That's a good question. There's a lot of issues around that. So they don't have to be the same size. The layer that you're going to use as your replacement just needs to replace the area that you're interested in. So in the case of a sky, I'm trying to replace the full width of the image, but certainly not the full height of the image. Um, so I did have to resize it. It kind of depends on where it came from. If it's both shot on the same camera, oftentimes there's very little resizing that needs to be done. If it's a stock image, kind of like the ones that come with the suite, they might be smaller than what your camera shoots, and they'll have to be resized up. But in a lot of cases, when you're working on a sky, you don't really care about the quality of the detail because they're very soft, subtle things like clouds. Blowing them up 300 or 400% isn't really going to be noticeable. If you're working on something that has much more detail and the detail's important, then you might need to use something like perfect resize to resize it up. But it would be pretty rare that you'd have to do that. Even if you're using a texture, oftentimes textures aren't going to suffer from being scaled up quite a bit. There we go. You can see how that perfect eraser really does a great job of getting rid of a lot of those distractions. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. I think I now want to work on the sky a little bit. Now, rather than replacing the sky, because this sky is so bright and white and it has a lens flare through it, and I really want to keep that lens flary look, we're going to actually blend another sky in. We're going for a little bit more artistic leeway on this shot. Let's go back to Lightroom, and at the same time, I mean, notice if you look at the file names, literally just a few minutes later, there was a much more interesting sky in the same area. I mean, this is what 20 some odd frames apart. So I'm just going to grab this sky that looks a lot more interesting than that sky, and we'll go to Plugin Extras, and this time I pick that bottom option, Add as a Layer to Perfect Layers, and it's now going to add that layer to the file that I'm working on. So I'm just going to click on the Merge option instead of the Create option, and that'll now stick that other sky in there. I'm going to use the Perfect Eraser just to get rid of some of these big dusties. This is like a 10-year-old camera, so there's all sorts of little dust bunnies in here. There we go. And we're just going to use that transform tool again to kind of position where we want it. I want to bring it up so that the horizons are in the same vicinity, but I'm kind of looking at the clouds that I want to add. I want to create some interesting looking clouds. This is actually quite a bit wider now because remember we cropped the original image, so I actually have stuff hanging off the sides. That's okay. There we go. We'll add that in, and now I'm just going to use the masking brush to paint away the bottom where we don't want it. A lot of times it's very quick to use the masking bug to get started, so I'm going to use the masking bug. This will help me get rid of a big area very quickly, like that. Now, notice how as we blend these two together, because there's so much what's called atmospheric distortion, there's so much haze in the background, you see how each successive ridgeline or mountain gets lighter and lighter. As long as I just blend these two layers together in kind of a tricky way, like this, it's actually fairly plausible still, without doing anything other than just a simple gradient mask. So I'm going to go to about there, then we'll grab our brush. I'm going to use a low amount on my brush and a big feather. Again, we're making a big, soft brush. Make sure it's set to paint out, and then we'll just kind of use it selectively. That was a little too much there. On the foreground, just to help us blend in some of those hills a little bit more. There we go, kind of like that. Now here's one of those cases where we're going to use that handy new stamped layer option because I want to merge my foreground and background together. So now I've got a new stamped version of it. We'll send it to Perfect Effects. we'll use that same sunshine filter that we used on a previous shot. So we'll start off with sunshine. You notice how I use that quick view browser. It makes it so fast and easy to pick out the one that I want. I'm going to use the, let's go for the strong option here. There we go. I really only want it on the foreground, so we'll use the masking bug again, just to, I always pick the wrong one, there we go, to really just apply it just to the foreground. Add another layer, and I want to add a glow to it this time. And we'll go to our glows. Again, same thing, we'll use that quick view browser, and just kind of go through and find kind of a nice Tuscany, Italian-y kind of a glow. Something like, oh, Deep Forest might be a nice one, or Dreamland. Let's use Dreamland. There we go. You can always adjust how strong those effects are just using the amount slider. I'm going to bring that up and make it a little bit softer and a little bit more saturated. There we go. And let's apply that. And let's take a look at our difference. So there's our original shot, blown out sky, all sorts of junk in the foreground. Keep in mind we cropped off the biggest distraction on the left, and then just by subtly painting in, we didn't even necessarily replace, we just overlaid another sky on top of it from a similar plausible time of day, and then used a little bit of Perfect Effects to get to there. Alrighty. I think we're just a little bit after 10. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
There was a question about whether or not you would remove the lens flare. There were quite a few questions about the lens flare in this image.
Oh, I wouldn't. I love lens flare, so I think it's what kind of makes the image in this late afternoon light like this. I would personally leave it. You could remove it. It's a lot of work to remove lens flares. It can be very difficult. The Perfect Eraser does make it a lot easier than it has been in the past, but I like it. I would leave it.
There were also a ton of questions about whether you use a tablet for your editing process.
To be honest, I don't. I'm just using a old-fashioned Apple mouse today. That's what I typically use. I do have a Wacom tablet. I use it occasionally. I use it mostly when I'm doing portrait retouching. I find that to be the most useful time for me doing it. Or if I'm doing very intricate masking, anything if I know I'm going to be spending like a half hour or more on an image, then I will. But everything we're doing in a webinar is fairly short. It's only a few minutes per image, so I don't use it then.
And then one last question that also is popping up. Do you ever make adjustments in Lightroom in the Develop module before you bring your images into the photo suite? You kind of went straight from the library into here, so a lot of people are wondering.
Sure, yeah, no, I definitely will. If you're a Lightroom user or an Aperture user, I would do a lot of my starting work in Lightroom or Aperture, especially things like lens correction, perspective correction, the upright tools in Lightroom that are new work very well. I would do my noise reduction there. I would probably even do my first round of brightness and contrast adjustments. I would tend to leave them a little bit soft. That way I have more ability to work in the suite. If you really have too much contrast, you could always add contrast, but removing contrast is more difficult. So I would tend to use Lightroom for corrections, not for enhancements, and then I would leave my enhancements to the suite.